good morning, afternoon, or evening, just whenever you happen to be watching this lecture. It was nice to virtually meet all of you on the discussion board this week, and so this week you were asked to answer a discussion board question and complete the Chapter 2 quiz. Without further ado, let's jump into this lesson. This week's lecture will be on the methods of research that's used in sociology. So one cannot have research without a method. A method is a study design that allows us to systemically study the social world. These methods make our findings more reliable. An example of this would be Pager's audit study found in the textbook. Pager's study helped to understand if there was a bias in the hiring and interview process for those who have a criminal record. Pager sent multiple applicants, all with the exact same resume, except half of the resumes stated that the applicant had a criminal record, while the other half did not say the applicant had a criminal record. Pager found out through the study that a bias did exist, as those who had a criminal record were far less often called for an interview. While researchers are looking for evidence that proves their conclusions are right, they're also looking for evidence that their conclusion is wrong. While this may sound a little confusing, it's not just enough to prove your conclusion is right. You must also prove that your conclusion is not wrong. So while one can never be sure that their conclusion is 100% correct, one can be more confident that their findings and conclusions are correct if they attempt to find information or data that proves their conclusion wrong and cannot. This also helps researchers avoid confirmation bias, which is the tendency we have to look for and accept information that reinforces what we already believe. When doing research, the most important thing is to make sure that the research is being conducted ethically, especially when it involves human subjects. So human subjects, that's just human beings that the researcher is using for their research project. Following World War II, the world became more aware of the experiments and research that the Nazi Party was conducting in Germany. Due to the ethically void research that was taking place, the Nuremberg Code was created in 1948. This code outlined what basic research principles are when using human subjects. If you're interested, you can read a little bit more about this code in the textbook and other human research projects that have gone wrong in the Reading and Resources folder in Blackboard. So if you go to course content or course modules, you click on module 2, there's a folder called Reading and Resources. This is where I post the chapter reading that you need to do out of the textbook, but I also throw in a few interesting articles that are related to the lecture. You don't have to read those, but they are there for your information and just enjoyment. Speaking of unethical research, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment is one of the most famous and inhumane research projects. This project took place in Tuskegee, Alabama from 1932 to 1972 and was conducted on poor black men and women who had syphilis. The belief at the time was that race played a role in one's health. Therefore, studying black men and women in Alabama was considered necessary. This, of course, was incorrect. This brings up the point of informed consent. Informed consent requires that all human subjects be made aware of the research project, what they will be subjected to, and any and all risks that may come about due to this research. Human subjects that were used in the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, they weren't made aware of these risks. They were not made aware of really what the project was. They just believed that they were being tested on their health. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, I've embedded a video in this slide. Just click on the photo and the video will pop up. You can find all of my PowerPoint slides available on Blackboard. They're posted in that course module folder. So this one will be posted in the course module 2 folder. So, types of research. There are two types of sociological research. The first type is quantitative research. This is data that comes from numbers and it reflects quantities and amounts. Easy way to remember that is quantitative, quantities. The second type is qualitative data. This data does not come from numbers, but rather it reflects a general theme. Qualitative data comes from interviews, transcripts, surveys, etc. So while researchers can choose one type of research to focus on, most researchers use a mix of the two methods. And this is appropriately referred to as a mixed methods research. And so let's say you conduct a survey, right? And you collect responses. Well, now you have some data. You have data on this response. You can then run some quantitative data or quantitative methods to analyze this data even more. So back to methods. There are 5 primary research methods that researchers use when conducting sociological research. The first of the 5 are surveys. As the name says, researchers will create surveys for a participant to fill out. The researcher will then tabulate the data and find conclusions based on this data. The second of the 5 methods is participant observation. This is where a researcher will spend time with a group, directly observing and participating in that social world. The researcher will then draw conclusions based on the experience they had in that social world. And so one example of participant observation is a research project that I partook in last year. Pre-COVID, me and multiple other students that were in a class, we went to the Grove. We also used surveys, so we handed out surveys, but we partook in the Grove and the game day setting, and we observed. We wrote about our findings later on. We used data from the surveys as well to inform this analysis. The third is experiments. This is a method where characteristics and behavior are controlled, allowing the research to research a specific thing. The fourth method is historical analysis. This is where a researcher looks into historical archives to supplement their research. Think of this as a historian, how they would use archives and historical material to create research. Sociologists, they do the same with this archive material. There's an entire section of sociology dedicated to historical analysis. You can use old newspapers, you can use old books, you can use old photos, pretty much anything in an archive, and this will help supplement your information. I know I had a fellow student in the grad program who she was focusing on historical analysis for her thesis, and her thesis was on Martin Luther King Jr. and altruism. And so to supplement this research, she would spend a lot of times in the historical archives going through archive materials and documenting this. So the fifth and final method is content analysis. This is very similar to historical analysis, where a researcher looks at content to supplement their research. But content analysis usually means newspapers, television shows, other types of media. And so you can go on like YouTube and find old TV shows and use that. Newspapers are a very popular source for researchers. They generally reflect the general consensus of the society that they're reporting on. So using newspapers, you can kind of put yourself in the feet, or in the shoes, put yourself in the shoes of someone living at this time, reading the newspaper. Newspapers traditionally are non-biased, non-partisan, just reporting the news. And so if you're reading a newspaper from, say, 1988, okay, you can put yourself in the shoes of somebody who was alive in 1988, read this newspaper article, and understand, okay, so this is what was happening. And you can form your own opinions of it and think, okay, so this is how some people must have thought. So prior to actually beginning your research, one must formulate a research question. This is what will guide your research project. The research question is what you are trying to prove or disprove. And after you have your research question, you have to determine your unit of analysis. The unit of analysis is what you will be observing in your research. This could be a group of people, a certain statistic, or a certain phenomenon. And so when you're going about, let's say you create a research question. And your research question is something like, does drug use have an effect on income, yearly income? You would then have to figure out who are you going to analyze to supplement this research question, to try and answer this research question. This is your unit of analysis. Next, you would need to find your variables. A variable is a factor or a characteristic that has more than one possible value. So here's a little bit more on those variables. There are two variables: your independent and your dependent variable. Your independent variable is the variable that affects what you were trying to explain. The dependent variable is the variable that you are trying to explain. What you are looking for here is covariation. This is where there is a relationship between these two variables. So, one example of this, it comes from the textbook actually. Let's say we're researching the relationship between the length of your thumb, that would be your independent variable, the length of your thumb, and how it influences your yearly income. This is your dependent variable. It's highly unlikely that you will find any relationship between these two. Therefore, there is no covariation. Now, once you've conducted a little early research, usually a literature review, that's just where you would go read literature that's already been published on your topic. So you would use a database typically like Google Scholar or JSTOR. You would search keywords and you would find other published material on either the same exact topic you're researching or something very similar. You can use this literature research and then come up with a hypothesis. This is just a statement about how you believe a variable relates to another one. This leads to operationalization, which is a decision on how to actually measure the variables in one's research. So, when doing research on a population of people, you obviously cannot include the entire country, state, county, or even a city of people. Therefore, you must figure out who you are going to include as a representative of the population. There are a few ways to do this type of sampling. The first thing one does, though, is create a sampling frame. This is how you determine who will be contacted to be part of your sample. Now, most researchers, they will use random sampling to decide who will be part of their sample. Now, while the title says random, it is not just randomly picking people. Every member of the population must be known and have a chance of being selected. Think of it like drawing names out of a hat. If I was to put everyone's name who is in this class into a hat and pull up 10 names, that is a true random sample. Now, ethnography is a form of research, but the textbook included it in this section of the chapter, so I did as well. Again, you're going to hear me say that a lot this semester. Refer to the textbook. You can find a lot more information on these topics than I can give you in this quick 15 to 18 minute lecture. Ethnography, this is where a researcher will embed themselves into an environment and partake in an in-depth qualitative study of a social group and their culture. An example of this comes from the book Evicted by Matthew Desmond. Desmond, he wanted to research eviction in the life of those who were facing eviction. So, Desmond moved to Milwaukee and lived in a trailer park among those who either had been evicted, were facing eviction, or could possibly be evicted. Desmond then spent a lot of time, he spent, I think, over a year and a half there, and he wrote a book on it. It's a very popular book, it's a very good book. And essentially all he did was he made field notes, and then he wrote about the experience of these people. That's a sociological research. So, while most researchers will use random sampling to decide who they're going to include in their research, some researchers also use non-random sampling. This is where members of a population have no chance of being selected for the research. This could be used when you need to exclude a group of people from the selection, such as excluding by race, age, or sex. Now, once you have your sample, not everyone's going to respond to your research. This could result in non-response bias. This is where you need to make sure there's not a systematic reason that people are not participating. Once the research has been finished, you have to find if your conclusion is correct or not. This is where correlation and causation come into play. Correlation, this is when variables are related to one another in some way or another. Causation is evidence that the independent variable caused the change on the dependent variable. The direction of the relationship is simply which variable affects the other. And so, think of causation, right? So we talked about the length of the thumb and income as an example of a research question. Could you find that the length of your thumb has any cause on income? No. So there is no causation there. The direction of the relationship, this is just simply where the variable affects the other, which variable affects the other. Does the independent variable affect the dependent, or does the dependent somehow affect the independent variable? Speaking of causation, causal relationships, this is where causation exists. A spurious relationship is where it looks like there's a connection between the two variables, but in reality, there's another variable that has not been taken into account, and this is affecting our independent variables. Sometimes you just miss one of the variables, and you forget about one. That's when you have a spurious relationship. Lastly, once your research project is finished, one has to determine the validity of the measures. This is to make sure you really measured what you meant to measure in the project. One of the many pitfalls that one may experience when conducting research is social desirability bias. This is where subjects tend to give answers that they believe are socially acceptable or that you want to hear. So let's say you're to ask questions of a personal nature. Something like you're interviewing teenagers about their sex life. People tend to be more honest if they're anonymous or asked in private compared to if they're asked around their friends or family or if their name's tied to it. In reliability, similar to validity. This is where you measure the consistency of your measurements, making sure your measures are consistent across the board. So, this wraps up our second lecture here. It's a little shorter than the first one. I know this is a difficult to understand topic sometimes. There are some things about research methods that myself, I struggle to remember or understand. But remember, check out the textbook. Chapter 2, it does an amazing job of explaining all of this to you. Better than I may have done. And so don't just rely on this lecture or this PowerPoint. Also rely on the textbook to supplement this PowerPoint and this lecture. So, best of luck to you. I'll be looking forward to hearing from your discussion board posts that are due on Wednesday night at midnight.